It really is a pleasure to be here, and I think this event tonight is timely, it's important, it's a conversation that we're delighted to be having. It's my distinct pleasure to introduce the first of our two guests, Michele Norris. Michele is familiar to many of us as a resident of Chilmark, but more importantly, as an award-winning journalist, as host of All Things Considered on NPR, a former journalist, a current and former journalist, spent, I think, many years with ABC News and the Washington Bureau. Before that, she wrote for the Chicago Tribune, for the Washington Post, the LA Times, has extraordinary credentials. Michele has written a wonderful memoir of her own family's racial identity. It's on sale after this session, called The Grace of Silence. She's also the founder of the Race Card Project. That is an exceptional project that asks people to identify how they feel about race in just 6 words. And you'll hear segments on NPR. You'll also, you can find out more on her website, theracecardproject.com. I hope you'll welcome Michele Norris, as I will. Here she is. Thank you.
Good evening, everyone. Now, I sometimes have to do that twice because the sun is shining, the sun is setting in a glorious way. We're in Chilmark. So let me try it again. Good evening, everyone, because it is a good evening. And just, Jane, thank you very much for that wonderful introduction. I don't want to set anyone's fingers flying trying to check this out. You said I'm a resident of Chilmark. I'm actually not a resident of Chilmark, but just down the road. In Vineyard Haven. I just know that things like that count. So people are, I didn't know, wait a minute, I didn't know that she was from Chilmark now. So I just wanted to clear that up. And special thank you to everyone who helps put the book festival together. It is really a treasure. Thank you, Sue Ellen, I sent you a note to say this today. Thank you for your passion, for your talent, for your vision. We all reap benefits from all of the work that you do. One of the wonderful things about Martha's Vineyard is, yes, it is a vacation spot, but so often when people go on vacation, they push the world away. And one of the interesting things about this glorious place is when people come here to sojourn, they open themselves to the world. They come here to engage with other people, to engage with ideas. And that's what we're going to do here tonight. Thanks to Cape Air and to the Vineyard Gazette, and to a special shout out to WBUR, member of the family, and all that you'll be doing to bring the wonderful work at the festival to people who actually can't be here in person. This is a very special evening. We have an opportunity to talk to someone who has opened up his heart and his mind and his soul, really, to look at one of the thorniest issues in America in a very, very personal way. It's a special evening because we have an opportunity to talk about something at a moment when we really do need to talk about it, when we really do need to think about it, not just what's happening today here, but American history. I'm, of course, talking about Ta-Nehisi Coates. And I want to just, by way of introduction, tell you a little about him if you're not familiar with his work. And I have my device here, not because I'm checking email, but because I also know, just as town count, so do titles. So I want to make sure that I get his correct as I reach back. You're not sensitive? Okay, well, I just want to make sure. In the age of Twitter, though, you have to be careful about that. So Ta-Nehisi is a writer, he's a journalist, he's an educator, he's a student, and we all benefit from that because his is a busy mind. Every time you talk about him, he gets excited about small discoveries. If you follow him on Twitter, and if you are on Twitter, as my mother calls it, the Twitters, you should follow him because he puts interesting ideas into your timeline. He's often leading conversations. He's sometimes fussing at people. He's sometimes correcting people, but he's always putting interesting ideas in our path. He's a treasure, and we're lucky to spend the evening with him tonight, and he does have some official titles. He's a senior editor for The Atlantic, and he writes about culture and politics and social issues, and yes, he writes quite a lot about race in America. He's a former writer for The Village Voice and the Washington City paper. He has been a contributor to Time, to O, to the New York Times Magazine. He's contributed to the Washington Post newspaper. He's a prolific voice, now also on television. He loves to instigate debate, and he likes to spar with people who think that they can hold their own, and sometimes he has to. And I've said this before about him. He will sneak up on someone who, in the manner of that James Brown song, is talking loud and saying nothing. And to sort of sneak up to them or remind them, maybe you don't have your facts right. Let me school you a little bit. In 2008, he published a memoir called The Beautiful Struggle, A Father, Two Sons, and an Unlikely Road to Manhood. He's continued on his road to memoir, or through memoir, with his most recent volume, Between the World and Me. I assume you've heard about this book. It would be almost impossible not to have heard about this book unless you've been living under a rock. Ta-Nehisi has been interviewed many times. He has been on the cover of magazines. He holds a special spot right now in the New York Times bestseller list. #1 feels good, I imagine. And he's going to join me tonight in conversation with each other and also with you. We have 2 microphones in the room at about the halfway point. I'm going to invite you into this conversation because this is such an important topic. It's wonderful that the 2 of us get to talk, and T, you can start to make your way up. It's wonderful that we get to talk, but a conversation as important as this should be robust and should include the room as well. So join me in welcoming Ta-Nehisi Coates.
Thank you, guys. It's always the hazards of being a tall person. I guess I can stoop a little bit. I'm going to, can you hear me back there? You can't hear me? One person can't hear me, sorry. I'll try to speak up a little bit. So I'm gonna, do some thank yous, and then I'm gonna read it, and I'm gonna talk to Michele. I'm gonna make my preamble really, really quick. First of all, I have to say first and foremost, thank you to my beautiful wife, Kenyatta, who is in New York right now, finishing up packing, and I'm feeling terrible about that. We're leaving the country in a week, and she's finishing up the last bit of it, and so if you guys would, I'm not a particularly religious or spiritual man, but I will say if you would send her any positive energy you have, I would greatly appreciate it. I'm gonna be doing plenty of penance over the next few weeks. Second person I wanna thank is Chris here? Did Chris make it?
He's on his way.
Oh my God. I know, it's not, I feel bad for him. It's okay, it's okay. My editor, Chris Jackson, who is not here, who I'm gonna thank anyway in absentia, who almost deserves to be a co-author on this book. There are very few people in the book industry who you can come to with a vague notion, as I did, and with some sense of some things that are missing in the world, and try to figure out how you can craft that into a book and be able to do that in, I think, under 2 years. I think we got it done in under 2 years. And I couldn't have done this book without Chris. It's just that simple. I could not have written this. I could have written, the rough draft, which I handed to him, which was a mess, about a third of which ultimately made it into the book. But without him, as my co-pilot on this book, it just would be utterly impossible. Between the World and Me is about a few things, but if I had to pick out a dominant theme in the book, it is about fear. Fear is an underestimated emotion in African American lives. Anger is an overestimated emotion in African American lives. People love to look at black people in pictures, on video, in certain poses, and talk about how angry they are or why they're angry. But what folks don't like to talk about is the massive and consistent amount of violence that characterizes black life in this country from 1619 up until now, and the great fear that's put on all of us. This book is a letter written in the form of a letter to my son. It is, as I said, mostly concerned with fear. I am going to read from a portion of it at the very beginning where I'm trying to describe to my son what it felt like as a young man growing up in West Baltimore and how I coped with that fear and how I dealt with that fear and what I saw all around me. one last thing before I get started. The other thing that Between the World and Me is quietly, though not stated, is really a tribute to the black writers who made this possible. And so there are people who are slyly nodded to. Obviously, Toni Morrison is nodded to on the front. They got their blurb and put it on the back and the front. That's how corporate publishing works. But besides Toni Morrison, there's Amiri Baraka, who has an ellipsis in here, who's very important to me. Richard Wright, who has an ellipsis in here, who's very important to me. James Baldwin, obviously, who has an ellipsis in here, who's very important to me. And the book begins, at least this portion of the book, begins with a quote from a Sonia Sanchez poem that I just adore. I've read many of these authors when I was 17, 18, 19 years old, and they just shifted my world. And I've spent this past 20 or so years just reciting their work in my head over and over again. And it gives me great, great pleasure to make this book and in some way say thank you to them. So I'm just going to begin with a short ellipsis from Sonia Sanchez, and then I'll go in. Do not speak to me of martyrdom, of men who died to be remembered on some perished day. I don't believe in dying, though I too shall die, and violets like castanets will echo me. I was afraid long before you, and in this I was unoriginal. When I was your age, the only people I knew were black, and all of them were powerfully, adamantly, dangerously afraid. I had seen this fear all my young life, though I had not always recognized it as such. It was always right in front of me. The fear was there in the extravagant boys of my neighborhood, in their large rings and medallions, their big puffy coats, and full-length fur-collared leathers, which were their armor against the world. They would stand on the corner of Gwynn Oak and Liberty, or Cold Spring and Park Heights, or outside Mondawmin Mall, with their hands dipped in Russell sweats. I think back on those boys now, and all I see is fear, and all I see is them girding themselves against the ghosts of the bad old days when the Mississippi mob gathered round their grandfathers so that the branches of the black body might be torched, then cut away. The fear lived on in their practiced bop, in their slouching denim, their big T-shirts, their calculated angle of their baseball caps, a catalog of behaviors and garments enlisted to inspire the belief that these boys were in firm possession of everything they desired. I saw it in their customs of war. I was no older than 5, sitting out on the front steps of my home on Woodbrook Avenue, watching 2 shirtless boys circle each other close and buck shoulders. From then on, I knew that there was a ritual to a street fight, bylaws and codes in their very need, which attested to all the vulnerability of the black teenage body. I heard the fear in the first music I ever knew, the music that pumped from boom boxes full of grand boasts and bluster. The boys stood out on Garrison and Liberty, up on Park Heights, and they loved this music because it told them, against all evidence and odds, that they were masters of their own lives, their own streets, and their own bodies. I saw it in the girls in their loud laughter, in their gilded bamboo earrings that announced their names 3 times over. And I saw it in their brutal language and hard gaze, how they would cut you with their eyes and destroy you with their words for the sin of playing too much. Keep my name out your mouth, they would say. I would watch them after school, how they squared off like boxers, Vaselined up, earrings off, Reeboks on, and left at each other. I felt the fear in my visit to my Nana's home in Philadelphia. You never knew her. I barely knew her. But what I remember is her hard manner, her rough voice. And I knew that my father's father was dead, and that my Uncle Oscar was dead, and that my Uncle David was dead, and that each of these instances were unnatural. And I saw it in my own father, who loves you, who counsels you, who slipped me money to care for you. My father was so very afraid. I felt it in the sting of his black leather belt, which he applied with more anxiety than anger. My father, who beat me as if someone might steal me away, because that is exactly what was happening all around us. Everyone had lost a child somehow to the streets, to jail, to drugs, to guns. It was said that these lost girls were sweet as honey and would not hurt a fly. It was said that these lost boys had just received a GED and had begun to turn their lives around. And now they were gone, and their legacy was a great fear. Have they told you this story? When your grandmother was 16 years old, a young man knocked on her door. The young man was your Nana Joe's boyfriend. No one else was home. Ma allowed this young man to sit and wait until your Nana Joe returned, but your great-grandmother got there first. She asked the young man to leave. Then she beat your grandmother terrifically one last time so that she might remember how easily she could lose her body. Ma never forgot. I remember her clutching my small hand tightly as we crossed the street. She would tell me that if I ever let go and were killed by an onrushing car, she would beat me back to life. No one else laughs at that. When I was 6, Ma and Dad took me to a local park. I slipped through their gaze and found a playground. Your grandparents spent anxious minutes looking for me. When they found me, Dad did what every other parent I knew would have done. He reached for his belt. I remember watching him in a kind of daze, awed at the distance between punishment and offense. Later, I would hear it in Dad's voice, either I can beat him or the police. Maybe that saved me. Maybe it didn't. All I know is the violence rose from the fear like smoke from a fire, and I cannot say whether that violence, even administered in fear and love, sounded the alarm or choked us at the exit. What I know is that fathers who slammed their teenage boys for sass would then release them to the streets, where their boys employed and were subject to the exact same justice. And I knew mothers who belted their girls, but the belt could not save these girls from drug dealers twice their age. We, the children, employed our darkest humor to cope. We stood in the alley where we shot basketball through hollowed-out crates and cracked jokes on the boy whose mother wore him out in front of his entire 5th grade class. We sat on the number 5 bus headed downtown, laughing at some girl whose mother was known to reach for anything: cable wires, extension cords, pots, pans. We were laughing, but I know that we were afraid of those who loved us most. Our parents resorted to the lash the way flagellants in the plague years resorted to the scourge. To be black in the Baltimore of my youth was to be naked before the elements of the world, before all the guns, fists, knives, crack, rape, and disease. The nakedness is not an error nor pathology. The nakedness is the correct and intended result of policy, the predictable upshot of people forced for centuries to live under fear. The law did not protect us, and now in your time, the law has become an excuse for stopping and frisking you, which is to say, for furthering the assault upon your body. But a society that protects some people through a safety net of schools, government-backed home loans, and ancestral wealth, but can only protect you with the club of criminal justice, has either failed at enforcing its good intentions or has succeeded at something much darker. Thank you.
Ta-Nehisi, why did you decide to read that section of the book?
Why did I decide to read that section? Well, I think it's like if there's a thesis in the book, it really is like right there. And there's another section at the end that I've been reading everywhere, and I kind of got bored. So I thought I would try it out. But I think that section is really, really important because I think it sets up everything. Like there's a lot that comes after that, violence, some death, and other things. And I think
And history.
And history. And I think it actually all rebounds back to that idea of fear.
I want to just back up, if I can, on how this book came to be, because you write, there's a theme of history, there's a theme of fear, but there's also a theme of history, and forcing the reader to look back at a difficult history in America, at a history that we often glaze over in schools, in college, America loves history. If you look at the top 10 lists, it's always full of historical tomes, but we don't look back with clear eyes at the American history when it comes to race. And in this small volume, you really force the reader to do that. But this book began as an exploration of history. That's correct.
Yes,
you were originally going to write about the Civil War.
I was contracted to write about the Civil War. Yeah, I had a contract to write a series of essays about the Civil War. The problem was I had written quite a bit about the Civil War for The Atlantic, and usually that's exactly how you get your book contract. But I felt like spent in many ways. Like I felt like I had said what I had wanted to say, at least in that form, about the Civil War. And so when I sat down to write, there was nothing happening at all. So that was bad. And then a number of things happened, and I guess one of which I can publicly talk about now. God, I don't even know how to say this. The President of the United States has these off-the-record conversations from time to time. And I'm only talking about this because it was talked about in another forum that involved the President of the United States. So my lips, I don't want anybody to think I'm up here snitching or something like that. Usually I wouldn't say anything about this. Anyway, I went to one of those forums. We got into a very somewhat intense debate.
He fussed at you.
He did a little bit. He did.
Actually, not a little bit.
Yeah, okay. I'll take that. He was upset about something I wrote. And it was a very interesting interaction. And I left that, and it was something about that moment that really struck me about like the times that we were, and well, I know what it was. I was in a room, and I was seated here, he was seated there, and we were the only two black people in the room. And everybody else was a reporter, and they had all asked these really, they were kind of challenging, but not really, it was not like an exchange. There was no fussing, there was no back and forth. And at some point, like during this exchange, I looked around, and all the other white people in the room were like this, like, what the hell is going on? What are these dudes doing? And it struck me like right then, like where we were in time. And so I had that. I had the death of a friend of mine who had been shot by a police department some 15 years earlier, and we were just in the run-up to this, current attention that we have on police departments and, shootings and everything like that. He was shot at a time where folks did not have body cameras, folks did not have cameras on their phones, and the way in which he was shot and the description of the events matched nothing about, what I knew about him or what anyone knew about him. I had been carrying that for a long time. In my heart. And I had recently made the mistake of rereading The Fire Next Time, which I had not read in 20 years. And I say the mistake because, you read that book and you feel like, oh, I'm not writing. I'm actually not really writing. I'm just sort of banging at a keyboard. But I felt that, like, that book was so relevant to today. Like, I felt like it had as much to say about the world, at that point, about the civil rights movement as it was, at that time, as it did about today, and I was deeply, deeply inspired by it. Obviously not to, rewrite, paint by the numbers, but I took great, great inspiration from it. And after, carrying all those things, I called my editor, Chris Jackson, and I said, I think like there can be like a really small book-length essay that can sum up, something about the feeling right now. So when I say vague notion, it was that, like, that's about all I had, like really vague. And he said, I think there can be too. And then, I went and wrote.
And you started writing.
Yes.
Now, when you say you were inspired by The Fire Next Time, when I read an early version of this, I thought you might have been inspired by James Baldwin's letter to his nephew. And in fact, even listening to you read tonight, when you talked through the litany of uncles who died and not in natural ways.
Right.
James Baldwin does almost the same thing in that letter to his nephew.
Right. The letter actually came really late. Like I had a draft of it, a pretty good draft of it, and then it felt really, really unfocused. And we had this idea. It's good we didn't do it. Oh man, that would have been bad. I didn't expect, like I knew I was inspired by Baldwin. I didn't expect that to become like the story though, and it's become like in a way, the story. And so this would have been really bad. But we had this idea, like we were gonna just have it as an essay, and then we were gonna have a letter. I was gonna write a letter to my son at the end, which really would have invited comparisons to Baldwin big time. But at any rate, once we had it, it didn't feel like focused enough, And so what I did was I tried to rewrite it, the draft I had, and think about who I was talking to. And I focused on my son, and that really just tightened the book a lot. Nothing in here is new to him. So it's not truly a letter. It's,
But it's a reflection of the conversations
it
that you
is,
have
it
with
is,
your
it is
son.
that. Yes, it is that. It is definitely the reflection of the conversation that we've had over years. But the letter was very much a literary device for me. I should say one other thing, too. It wasn't even so much like the politics of Baldwin that I was inspired by. It was the way he talked about the politics of his time, like the coldness, the directness, the just, okay, I'm not gonna use any foul language. The just, sort of I don't care-ness about it. Like, I think like in writers who write about race, your primary audience almost always, or the majority of your audience is almost always going to be white. And so there's always this question, I feel like, for a lot of writers of, okay, how do I get you to recognize this? How do I get you to see this? And Baldwin just seemed to write like he just didn't care. Mm-hmm. Like, you can either come over here, look, I'm gonna make this cake, and you can come have some or not, but I'm making the cake. Mm-hmm. Like that was how he wrote, and I wanted to like write like that, like really like write like for myself. He wrote in such a really self-centered, selfish way in the best sense of the word. He was unconcerned, and that was like, especially like at this moment with the president being who the president is, this desire to, bridge the gap, which I think is important, I think is true, and I think people need to do that work. I didn't want to do that work. I wanted to kind of walk the other way.
But how is that not doing the work? I don't understand that. What's the disconnect? If you're speaking your truth, how is that not doing the work of building a bridge to somebody else?
Well, I don't know. This is the book for building bridges. I mean, I don't know. I'll put it to you like this. When I wrote it, I didn't think
I guess what I'm asking is how, in building a bridge, why does that always have to have a kumbaya aspect to it? I mean,
I agree with you.
No, I mean, because if you're going to build a bridge, it doesn't mean that you have to agree.
Yeah.
You just have to see across the bridge. You might not like what you see across the bridge, but
and also bridges take time. You know what I mean? Like the idea that, I wrote this today, and so, everybody's going to see, now we're going to connect. Well, maybe that takes some time, So I very much agree with you. And the thing I've always told people that, listen, if I was going to, see, a speaker and they were going to, talk to me about LGBT rights in this country and the history, of violence that LGBT people have suffered in this country, I don't want to be made comfortable as a straight person. I don't go there to feel better about being straight. I go there to get the juice, to get the sauce. You know what I mean? I want the real. Give it to me. And so for me, like, I almost feel like it's out of respect for the reader. You know what I mean? You give it as raw as you can,
But there is an accusatory finger in the book.
Yeah, there is. Yeah. There should be.
And that points to, in large respect, white America.
The people who believe they are white, as we say in the book.
Yes, I was going to ask you that. The people who believe, which is such an interesting term. The people who believe that they're white. So we're going to have a glossary every so often where Ta-Nehisi is going to explain terminology. This is a good opportunity to do that. So you use that phrase several times, the people who believe they're white. Tell us what you mean by that.
Well, again, I mean, for me, this like goes back to Baldwin, although not directly. Some years ago, I read a book of his, an essay of his on being right, white, and other lies. It was a really, really powerful essay because the essay argues essentially there is no such thing as white people, or rather there is no such thing as white people divorced from the notion of power and the ability to plunder. There's a such thing as Jewish people. There's been a such thing as French people, that you can come here with a kind of ethnicity, but that the notion of a white race is totally built on the idea of power, and that black people actually are a little bit different. Black people have ethnicity. The race aspect is how we're oppressed, but our identity as black people has an ethnic and cultural component, that we are not the photo negative. And when I started Between the World and Me, I was having great difficulty because I kept using this term, white people, white Americans, white America, and it felt wholly inappropriate. In fact, it felt like I was reifying something that the book actually argues against, which is not just that there is no such thing as, white people or a white race, but that there really is no substantial such thing as race. And that, we have.
But race is something totally made up yet very real.
Yes. And so one of the things I argue in the book is that race is the child of racism, not the other way around. And so people have this theory that there are, races. There's a race of people that came from Africa. There's a race of people that came from Europe. There's a race of people that came from Europe, a race of people here in America. And when these people interacted on these shores, suddenly we had trouble. And what we need to do is get these differing races to get along with each other. But anybody that's traveled around the world knows that there's no definition of black that holds internationally. We also know there's no definition of black that really holds across time. There certainly is no definition of white that holds across time. We know that at different, periods in time, different people, believe that they're white or are ascribed to whiteness. And so I wanted to give as much disrespect as I could to that idea. I didn't want to reify. I didn't want to say, like, even in my attempt to describe the situation, I did not want to restate the problem.
And in talking about people who think they are white, as you describe them, you talk about the dream, and it's interesting how the American dream is rendered in your hands. Right. It is something that is based on plunder. Right. It is something that is based on violence. Right. It is something that is based on privilege, and there's a lot of debate about the term privilege right now, but the idea that there are certain goodies that accrue to me because of who I happen to be, or right. where I happen to live, or the status that I happen to hold. Right. And you want Americans to understand that as much as we think that that is an idea that is in our past, mm-hmm. and maybe even our distant past, that's right here in this room. Yeah, and it's, what can I say? I can't apologize for this. I was very inspired by James Baldwin, and that line, I think it's in The Fire Next Time, in one of his other essays, where he says, "It is the innocence that constitutes the crime." Mm-hmm. I read this, wow, that's incredible. Like the idea that, I have arrived here, I have certain things. I live in this suburb of, in my case, Baltimore. My parents worked hard. They threw up stakes. This community that we live in magically appeared. And the ability to wipe away everything else that happened that made that community appear in the first place, all the violence that's behind that community's existence. The dream is the belief in innocence. It's the belief that everything that you've acquired, everything that you have, all your privileges, all your rights, all the things that you enjoy, that we enjoy in this country, were somehow acquired fairly. And in the cases where they were acquired unfairly, that is somehow exceptional. It's not the norm for who we are, it's the exception. The argument I make in this book is that, in fact, the injustice, the violence is the road. It's the indispensable thing. And if you take the violence away, everything you love actually can't exist. Give me an example. What are you talking about? Everything you love can't exist. Well, an obvious example is enslavement, right? And I also, I think, like, for me, so I came to the Atlantic in 2008. But you're talking about everything. You're talking about America. I think were you making an argument that what Americans may love in contemporary times might not exist? What are you talking about? Well, we'll go more modern, the 20th century. I just gave this example of suburbs, and this notion about suburbs sort of just existing organically. Our suburbs are the result of social planning. They're the result of social engineering. In the 1930s and the 1940s, the powers that be in this country decided that we needed to have a broad middle class in this country. And part of the way that we built that broad middle class was that we went out and we subsidized home loans for a large swath of Americans. One group of Americans were cut out of that. It was black people. Hand in hand with us deciding that we were going to subsidize bank loans for average workaday people, we decided that we were going to cut black people out of that by redlining them and drawing lines around certain neighborhoods and making them ineligible for such loans. This is not like an abstract thing. This is a very, very real thing. You can't really imagine FHA loans. You can't really imagine the GI Bill, because these things have to pass through Congress without white supremacy. Because one has to argue how you would have gotten all the Southern senators to support it if it was going to empower black people in the same way that was going to empower white people. And in fact, it was written so that would not be the case. That's our history. That's why our neighborhoods look the way they do. I grew up in a neighborhood in West Baltimore, across the street from Montgomery Mall, where the riots that we saw a couple of months ago actually popped off. Those neighborhoods were redlined in much the same way. My grandmother, and I didn't find this out until I had done some journalism, just 2 years ago. I published a story called The Case for Reparations. And my mother calls me up, and she tells me about going to settlement, which what was settlement, but what my mother didn't, understand as to be settlement, to get the loan for a house that she thought my grandmother had owned for 15 years. In fact, my grandmother wasn't able to actually buy a house. She wasn't able actually to get financing for it, despite the fact that she had put herself through school at night, scrubbed white people's floors during the day, had done all the things that America tells you to do to be virtuous. She could not access the same kind of programs that most Americans do. This is not like, my grandmother is not an exception. And explain why she couldn't access those loans, because that's something that many people do not understand. Right, so I use the term redline. The way this worked is,
If you moved onto a block in Baltimore, and I'll keep it there, my neighborhood, if you moved onto a certain block in Baltimore, it was decided that your block was made ineligible for FHA-backed loans. And even if you weren't like buying through an FHA-backed loans, many of the private banks followed the same policies. Whatever major city you guys are from, when you get back, I mean, if you don't know anything about this, you can just go Google your major city and look up redlining map, and you'll see it. You'll see it plain as day.
And the redlining was based on the racial composition.
Exactly, exactly. One black person moves onto your block, and suddenly your entire block is ineligible. There's a short paragraph in my piece on reparations that I always think about. And there's a guy in Levittown, he's a white guy who's being interviewed. A black family is trying to integrate Levittown. And he, is being interviewed by the newspaper. And he says, well, Mr. Such and his wife, they seem like nice people, and they seem like good people, but every time I look at them, $3,000 drops off the value of my house. That's what I see. He wasn't lying. I mean, that was our policy to make that so. That family was going to move in, and suddenly, the eligibility for certain financing and loans was going to go away. And I just want to be very, very clear about this. Like the term, and this is one of the things I was trying to argue in the book, even the term that I just used, redlining, kind of misses the point, okay? Saying you're not eligible for a loan makes it abstract. The fact of the matter is, you're not eligible for a loan, so you can't keep up your neighborhood in the same way. You can't do certain things for your neighborhood in the same way that other people can. At the same time, you're subject to all sorts of other discrimination. Discrimination based on job, discrimination based on education. And you're surrounded by people who, at the same time, are subject to the same thing and have been generationally subject to discrimination, by the way. All of that compounds in the same neighborhood, in the same area. And the result often is violence at the end of the day, because what you're dealing with is a group of people who are frustrated in their attempts to access certain things, frustrated in their attempts to get certain places in life that are available for the rest of the country. And what you get is a people who are deprived. And so in that situation, it's no mistake as far as I'm concerned that you end up with violence.
Now, you know that your critics are saying that the last part of that explanation sounds like you're making excuses.
I mean, it's history. I don't really know what to say to that. I know I've had that before, but I don't really know what to say to that. One of my great arguments in this book and in general is that black people are human beings. And I guarantee you that if you subject any other group of human beings to the historical policies that this country has subjected black people to, you would see pretty much the same conditions. I feel as though, and I wrote this book, in service to this idea, that there is a myth. And the myth is that it is very, very hard to explain what's going on in African-American neighborhoods, the higher level of violence, the fact that black people lag, towards the bottom in virtually every socioeconomic category in this country. Well, I maintain that if an alien, and I've said this before, and if an alien visited the planet Earth and came to America and studied the history and studied the policies that America has directed towards black communities, the alien would not be confused about what was happening in those communities at all. We're only confused because we need to be confused. It's not, I don't think it's confusing at all. I think it's quite crystal clear. And the dream, the idea of innocence, necessitates the kind of self-confusing that I don't understand. But it's not that hard. Like I said, you can go look at the maps right now. It's not that hard.
So as difficult as this moment is that we find ourselves in, where there is this daily drumbeat, and I used to say monthly drumbeat, and then I started to say weekly drumbeat. At this point, I think I can safely say daily drumbeat of stories about violence that is brought to bear upon people of color, often at the hands of police, sometimes when they are behind bars. Is this a moment, as difficult as it is, that creates a moment of possibility to finally have a kind of reckoning and something akin to a sort of truth and reconciliation, if not the word commission usually follows that, but sort of some sort of a truth and a moment of truth and reconciliation.
I mean, I would like to hope so, but I don't think so. There's nothing new about what's happening. It is new that people are seeing it. And perhaps there's some group of people who are convincible, who are now persuaded in a way that they weren't persuaded 15 years ago when my friend Prince Joan was killed.
Is it harder to be innocent when you
in fact, I would argue that this moment,
with it?
as I'm thinking about it, I would argue this moment is almost sort of distortive. Because it could lead you to conclude that the real crime and the real violence is what the police are doing in the communities. But the police are just an expression of policy. They're just there. The police are not the problem. You know, the police are really the expression of America's will. I mean, the example I think about this all the time is with Freddie Gray, right? And everybody talks about, you know, oh, they gave Freddie Gray a rough ride. What was Freddie Gray doing? Oh, it's horrible what the police did to Freddie Gray. You got to go through the instances of how Freddie Gray got arrested in the first place. He is living in an area that has been designated a high drug area. That's by policy. By policy, it's been designated a certain way. And what that means is that police are allowed to do things in that area that they would not be able to do, say, on the Upper East Side of Manhattan. One of those things includes Freddie Gray looking at a police officer in a suspicious way and then running. He can be arrested for that. Now, if I look at somebody in a suspicious way, and well, maybe not me, somebody else looks at somebody in a suspicious way here in Martha's Vineyard, and maybe me, maybe I don't know, this is my first time here, looks at a police officer in a suspicious way and runs and is arrested for that, people would say, what the hell are you doing? But see, that's the policy in the Lexington Terrace area of West Baltimore. That's the policy, to deal with something that we could, think about a totally different way. We could think about, drugs, for instance, from a public health perspective, but we send in the hammers. And then when we send in the hammers, we wonder why people get hammered. We're confused by it. The Walter Scott situation. We have decided that the way to deal with our child support effectively, is, to have people arrested and held in jail for a month at a time so that they lose whatever, meager job Walter Scott had at the time. I understand completely why he ran. And that doesn't mean the guy should have shot him in the back. But why was he in that situation to begin with? You can literally go through almost every one of these cases and you can find policy behind it. And so this focus on police reform allows us to actually get away with the fact that we made it this way. We've decided we wanted it to be this way. And sending in hammers to deal with, problems in African American communities when we, tend to deal with things other ways in other communities is just not particularly new.
You talked in the reading about something, a constant fear, and I can't remember exactly the cadence of the words that you used, but just sort of a consistent fear. Your parents, an aggressive, consistent fear that just accompanied you with every step that you took, your parents with every step that they took. Is fear a part of this equation also? Is it possible that some of the violence that we see in that daily drumbeat is born of fear? That people of color are often the objects of fear.
I saw the guy who shot this dude, and who was the latest one? I can't even remember. What was it?
DuBose.
Cincinnati. He shoots the guy, and his lawyer comes out. He was afraid for his life. And I thought, why are you a cop? Like, how, in that situation, how are you a police officer and afraid? I have seen tougher things, in Baltimore. Growing up, really? I mean, I know that comes out a lot, but and then a friend of mine texted me, he said he's a cop because he's afraid. That the actual exercise of power allows for something. I know I hear that, and people say that.
But is that fear something that must be examined?
Yeah, I agree. And I know being a police officer is a tough job.
I don't know if you have agreed. I'm asking a question. Is there a fear? I mean, you've heard me ask this question before. I'm going to ask you all a very honest question. I hope that you will be honest with me in answering it. When you drive through your neighborhoods, wherever you come, and there's a diaspora of people here from all over America, most likely, when you drive through a neighborhood, if you see a person of color, how many times have you instinctively reached over, tried to be cool about it, but reached over and locked your door? No one is raising your hands, but I know that's happened. Okay, thank you very much for being honest. How many of you have been in an elevator and a person of color comes in and you don't even know why you do it, but suddenly you grab your purse a little bit closer to your body? How many times has that happened? Thank you. Because I know that happens, because it happens when I walk on the elevator. It happens when my kids walk through stores. My child walked through a store here and was followed throughout the store. I don't know that I'm going to go back to that store. I won't name the store, but that happens. That's fear.
Right.
Do we have to talk about that?
This is like the problem with Bridge, but I'm totally unsympathetic. I really am. I'm sorry. I live at 137th and I did until today, so I can tell you now. I live at 137th and Broadway. I have lived in Harlem for most of my time in New York, and not as a gentrifying owner. It's a neighborhood that you have to learn certain rules, in order to navigate. Life is hard. What right do you have to be secure? When I was not secure walking to school when I was 11 or 12 years old.
So you're saying it's a fact of life. It's just part of, it's
What's a fact of our condition right now?
Okay.
And as I'm sorry that, that there are white people who are afraid of black people. But there are black people living in neighborhoods with very, very real reasons to be afraid, socially designed neighborhoods with very, very, very real reason to be afraid. And I don't know, I worry very much about them.
We have a couple of microphones. If people want to, we'll take a few questions. If people want to make their way to the microphones on either side of the room. The title for this evening was What Happened to a Post-Racial America? I didn't dwell on that because if we just focused on that, it would be a short conversation. I don't know that there ever was a post-racial America, but the term is interesting. And I wonder, as a journalist and as an observer of society, if you have any thoughts on why America so readily embraced, if not the idea, at least the term. I mean, if you do research on the term post-racial, words don't enter the American lexicon in quite that way. You can mark a moment at 2006, where it first is mentioned, and then it sort of, its usage increases almost by Fibonacci numbers. Wow. It just explodes. Wow. Why did that happen? Why were we so eager to think about America in post-racial terms?
Well, I think even if people don't want to do the work of getting over it, they do want to get over it. They do want to get past it, even if they're not, equipped to do what needs to be done yet. It's the dream, You press a button, in a booth, you walk out, poof, it's over. The nightmare's done.
You mean in a voting booth?
Yeah, in a voting booth, and suddenly that's it. I want to be clear about something. I don't think that the election of a black president means that there's no progress. I think it means a particular kind of progress. It's clear that it wouldn't have been possible 40 or 50 years ago. I think we are in a situation right now where individually, if you are an African American of particular talent, and perhaps more important, particular luck, you can do some things in this country. That was not so much true 50 years ago. It was just a straight sort of dismissal across the board. It was not as true. At the same time, largely, if you're talking about the African American community, I think there's been considerably less progress for the community as a whole.
Let's take some questions. I want to begin with you. Give us your name. Tell us where you're from.
Hi, I'm Kim Bowers. I'm from Harlem, born and raised. Thank you for the trip down memory lane. We're the same age. So hearing the boom boxes and the bamboo earrings was a treat. My question is whether or not, like officers, whether or not the media is a hammer as well. That's just something that, sometimes the way we're, depicted in the media also lends to the fear that I mean, there's white people that's never even been in a room with black people, so they shouldn't fear them, and else they've gotten a different understanding of blackness. And I think that has something to do, has been communicated in the media.
Yeah, maybe so. Maybe so. Again, I think the importance, though, is the source. The media's and I hate to talk about this amorphous thing, the media, but since we're going there, the media's preconceptions as they exist don't, come out of the ether. This is so old. This is so old. I have to get this in. I don't want to talk about things that happened for the 20th century, but I have to say this. And this is going to sound crazy, but I really believe it's true. The impact of enslavement on this country's history is greatly underestimated. It is tremendously, tremendously underestimated. That sounds like tired, right? Like, that sounds like something, I know people are like, oh, get over it, that was 150 years ago, blah, 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 which is not that long, by the way, but, only in America is that a long time ago. And just to give, again, I want to give, like, some, put some concrete. I don't want that to be like a sort of line that I'm just throwing out there. Black people were enslaved in this country and in the prehistory of this country longer than we've been free. We were enslaved for 250 years. We've been free about 150 years. At the onset of the Civil War, and I've said this over and over again, Martha, this is nothing new for you. At the onset of the Civil War, I feel like you could give this talk. At the onset of the Civil War, African Americans in this country, 4 million African Americans in this country enslaved, constituted the greatest asset in this country at the time, worth more than all the banks, all the nascent manufacturing, all the ships, all the railroads put together. Black bodies were worth more. If you wanted to find the most valuable section of this country, where you find the most multimillionaires per capita, you would not come up here to Martha's Vineyard. You would not go to Boston. You would not go to New York. You would not go to Chicago. You would go to the Mississippi River Valley. 60% of our exports, you're going to say 1860 were cotton. If you went to Mississippi, the majority of people living in there were enslaved. The majority of people living in South Carolina were enslaved. Half the people living in Louisiana were enslaved. The black body was a tremendous, tremendous asset in this country. When I say you can't imagine this country without it, like I mean that. Like it's literally true. It's not just sort of a rhetorical line you throw out at a speech. Without that source of wealth, deprived of that source of wealth, you can't imagine this country without it. What is behind enslavement is violence. Enslavement is systematic torture. That's what it is. It's legalized rape. It's the ability to take somebody's kid, 4-year-old kid, from the mother, from the father, put them on an auction block, and sell them from Virginia into somewhere into Mississippi. That's what it was. If you do that for 250 years, it tends to have some effects. And it's not like the violence stopped in 1860. When people talk about this idea of reunion, again, we make it really, really abstract. Okay, the North pulls troops out of the South. No, the North basically let the South have free hand with black people down there. And the way the South was redeemed, the way we had a reunion was through violence, was through lynching, was through killing. Greatest wave of domestic terrorism in this country's history. That's how it happened. When you do that, you reify certain beliefs. So by the time you get to a 20th century, where you start talking about having a mass media in the form that we know it today, what are certain beliefs that are already there? It would take quite a bit of root work to pull that out.
Do you pull it out, or do you take it up and at least examine it? I mean, I go again to reconciliation, the idea that South Africa had its Truth and Reconciliation Commission to actually look at what happened in a country. Stew on that, because I want to take another question.
Naivete has always been a problem, whether World War II or in Germany and all the rest of it. It's never a good excuse, and there's certainly no reason why you should be sympathetic to white frightened people or so. But the one example that I raised my hand about was just a decade ago in Greenwich Village, and I was 2 in the morning, and there were about 12 guys on my block, and I decided to walk straight through them. And as I passed, I heard one say to the other at the end, "She's in our logics class at Hunter College." So it was a situation where they knew me, and I had no clue as to who they were.
Thank you. Thank you. Martha, tell us who you are.
Good evening. I'm Martha Jones from Ann Arbor, Michigan, and Paris, France. And that's what I want to ask you about. As much as you've been talking about this book, I haven't heard you talk about the part that is about France and about Paris. And I wondered if you could help us appreciate what I think, when I read that passage, was about the way in which, in some sense, France brought into relief the United States and the place that you know so well. You don't even realize you know it. But maybe that it showed you something that you didn't know. So I don't want to presume, but I'd love to hear you talk more about that piece of the book. Thanks.
Oui, bien sûr.
Merci beaucoup.
It really, in some ways, I think it could have been anywhere. I mean, I think like the price of, and this is what comes out in the book, the price of living under those sort of conditions, where fear is like in your daily calculus, is that you see less. It infringes on your imagination. It infringes on your ability to see what's possible for you out in the world. And there's a moment a little bit later in the book, after those few pages, where I talk about taking a French class in 7th grade and just acting a fool, quite honestly. And acting a fool because French was an abstraction to me. I did not understand, I didn't know anybody who was French. I didn't know nobody spoke French. I knew that France was somewhere, like across an ocean. I think I could have pointed it out on a map, but it was very, very abstract. It was not like walk to school with 5 other dudes so you don't get jumped, which was, right there. It wasn't even like, the books on history that I had in my house. It seemed so distant. And one of the sort of amazing things is to, watch my kid, because I started studying French 2012, and he would come and he would sit in, on the with my tutor, and he would watch. And then one day he said, well, can I learn this? I said, are you serious? He said, yeah. I said, okay, all right. But I couldn't even conceive of it, because in my world, it was work. But he knew, like other people who spoke French. You know, has grown up, especially in recent years, among a different class of people. You know, he knows people who speak French. His kids on his soccer team who speak it. It's a very real thing to him. Like, it's an actual tangible idea. And so I think like there was a great deal of shame, like when I got there. I mean, it was, you know, there's all the beautiful things in the book, and it was very, very, you know, nice. Obviously, I like it very much. I'm going back. But I think there was, and it still is, and maybe this isn't so much in the book, like a great deal of shame over my own ignorance. I think that could have happened anywhere, you know? I think it ended up being France because my wife loves Paris, but I think, like, it could have been, you know, Barcelona, you know? It really could have been anywhere. It could have been Rome. It could have been anywhere, but the feeling of just not knowing, and not even not knowing, like, not knowing enough to even desire certain things. You know, like that's sort of what happens when you're like in this mentality of day to day, okay, you know, I gotta look out, gotta watch that dude, what's he thinking over there, what's gonna happen here if I don't do this? And to some extent how the education system was, maybe to a large extent, how the education system was designed where I went to school. You just don't, it had no utility for me. And when I went, for the first time as a 36-year-old dude, like I was incredibly ashamed. You know, I just got my adult passport for the first time in my life. I just felt like stupid. Like just really like, what have I been doing? Like what have I been thinking about? What have I, you know, why am I, you know, our mutual friend, Ta-Nehisi Coates, he told me recently, he spent the year in Russia on a Fulbright, and we were talking about this, and he was saying how when he was growing up, he thought of travel like as a luxury, like how you buy a pink suit. Like somebody might buy a pink suit, hey, I got a pink suit. That was what travel was to him. You know, it was like an extra piece of cheesecake or something. Like it was just something, why would you spend your money like that? Shouldn't you do something else? You know, shouldn't you worry? So for me, it really has been like an expansion, you know, of my imagination. I really adored the study of language. I find it deeply meditative. You know, that's been, you know, real. But I think, you know, it has caused me a great deal of sadness when I think about my childhood.
We have time for one more question.
Hi, Tony Horwitz, West
All my friends are
Tisbury.
asking questions.
Yeah, sorry.
He shouldn't get to ask a question. I'm going to see him afterwards.
Well, hopefully. One of many great passages regards history and our sort of, or most Americans feel good, sort of self-exonerating view of our history. And you have a great line about good intention being the hall pass of our history. And it made me wonder whether we have a broader problem, race being the most obvious, but all of our history, that we really do need these uplifting stories. And I'm wondering how whether it's even possible to overthrow that narrative, and if it's possible to do it without making our history such a bummer that no one even wants to read it.
Right. Well, I like reading it even though it's a bummer. You know, I mean, history is awesome. I mean, even when it's not, like, you know, you talk about a bummer. You read Barbara Tushman's A Distant Mirror? Have you read this? This is the history of the 13th century. I mean, you talk about a bummer, the 14th century. I mean, it's like the Black Death, 100 Years War. I mean, those are like the only like the highlights. It's just bummer. It's a great book. I mean, it's very interesting and very enlightening. You know, I'm learning a lot about, you know, human beings, and, you know, to give you an example of what I'm talking about, and I think, like, if I can get to your question, it's like, well, what is history supposed to do, right? And so there's a part in this book where she's talking about serfdom and how people talked about serfdom and how, you know, the knights and the elite class and the aristocrats described serfdom. They talk about how they're lazy, how they don't do anything, how they're bad for society, how they just, you know, suck at society, you know, basically they just take from us. You know, they're a bane, you know, God, you know, has a, you know, a curse. You know, just, and so much of it sounded familiar to me. Like, I was like, wow. Like, it's almost line for line, you know, loose morals. It was all there. It was all there. And that was like, you know, what, 600, 700 years ago. You know, and I guess one way of taking that is thinking, oh my God, well, there's nothing we can do about this. But the other way I took it was, you know, a reification of this idea, this counter-narrative, you know, that you see like in Barbara Field's work with her book, Racecraft. And that is the idea that the way people feel about black people, or the myths people put on black people, are not quote unquote natural. They don't come from just looking at somebody who's darker than you and then deciding, well, you have less morals, you don't work hard, you're loose, you don't like being married, all the ugly things people say. Like, it's not a natural thing to just look at somebody who's darker and say that. That it results from a need to do something to somebody, or a desire to do something to somebody, to justify it. That actually made me feel better about the world, because it meant that, it wasn't really in our hearts, that we had made certain decisions, and so if we make certain decisions, maybe it's possible for us to make other decisions, Having said that, I appreciate your question a great deal, because I've thought about this a lot. Like I was just saying earlier, this idea of pulling roots up. Well, how much of that is actually possible with the maintenance of a civil society? Like, that's like the really deep question. Like, if you talk about like an America without white supremacy, is that actually possible? Like, is that something that can be done? I mean, we know that white supremacy in this country is congenital. If you go to 1619, black people are here right away. Black people are like one of the oldest ethnic groups in this country. And enslavement is right there, and it's central to us. Like, you just can't have in America, you can't have these notions of democracy, these notions of freedom without it. You can't have a New Deal from Roosevelt without the way black people were cut out of virtually every single program. It just wouldn't have passed. You can't have reunion after the Civil War without that great wave of domestic terror. It's just not possible. If that's the case, then what is possible? I don't know. But one of the things that I go to in the book, because that question was profoundly with me. Well, if Ta-Nehisi, after hanging out with you historians, can be very, very depressing. It can be just really a total bummer, as you say. And so after that, if you decide that's the case, well, what should one do? How does one not retreat into despair? How does one not just decide to throw one's hands up and just do, whatever, desire comes to mind? And I think the answer in that is the notion that struggle in and of itself, regardless of what happens, is in fact noble. That it is the right thing to struggle. And the way I think about it is like this. As I said before, 250 years of enslavement in this country. What that means is that you go to a particular point in time in this country's history, or in colonial history, and you can find enslaved black people who would look back into their past, and for generations what they would see as other enslaved black people. And they would look into their future, and what they would see is more enslaved black people. I mean, that's quite a few generations of enslaved black folks in this country. And yet people struggled. They struggled anyway. Ida B. Wells, who wants to, get this lynching bill pushed through the Senate, dies, doesn't get to see that. One of the distortive aspects about it is we focus on these highlights, and so we think like Martin Luther King is the norm, that you struggle, you see some change, and that's what's normal for activists. Most activists don't actually get to see the fruit of what they struggle for come to bear. And so I don't know, as crazy as this sounds, how much it helps for me to think about what's possible. I feel like some duty to the ancestors, to folks who came before and struggled and got to see nothing to struggle. It just strikes me that it would be the height of just sin, to the extent that I believe in it, to get here, to be sitting here, right here talking to you guys, on the backs of other people, and then say, I'm done. I've concluded this is, not even worth it. You know what I mean? Somebody tweeted me this great Camus line where he says, you have to imagine Sisyphus happy. But that was awesome, right? Like I actually thought that was awesome. Like what he was saying was like the labor in and of itself is ennobling. And I know whether, my ultimate, dreams about, white supremacy being, sort of ripped out of this country are fulfilled or not, through the term of my natural life, it has been rewarding to explore. It's been rewarding to know. It's been rewarding to struggle.
And it's been rewarding to listen to you today.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.